Morning. As for those that will be coming online, this is January the 8th, the adult Bible class at the Palmetto Church of Christ. I'm Dick Marshall. No, I am not Mike Betts. Following Mike in his studying of the Sermon on the Mount is a little bit similar to following up coaching after Bear Bryant, all right? He is fabulous. Before we start in, I'd like to read a prayer. And I think I've told you before that Libby and I start the day off with a devotional out of a Max Lucado books. We have a couple of them. And this one was his prayer for January the 1. And I thought, well, with the establishing of our strategy for this year, this seemed like a very relevant thought. Father, you are worthy of us all. Father, you are so worthy of it all. My attention, my praise, my worship, and my love. Your works are amazing, beyond anything I can even express. Help me to be a light that shines towards you today. It is often hard for me to stare out from the world and be different. Give me the courage to make your goodness known and to never be ashamed. Please give peace to my friends who are standing up for you and as a result have found themselves friendless or with few who understand them. I thank you for your wonderful works and all that you have done and will do. In the glorious name of Jesus Christ, amen. I was asked towards early December to teach the class, and in order to make up study guides, that was not enough time to make up a new series of lessons. So I told Sean, I said, fine, I have material prepared for Hebrews and the epistles of John. And he said, that would be fine. All right, so he said, which one you want to choose? I said, the epistles of John. So I go in and start looking at publisher, which I put them all in. And wouldn't you know, the first lesson was not completed, and I only have 5 out of 13 lessons done. I don't know what I did the last time I taught 1 John, but obviously I didn't complete the study guide. Therefore, instead of getting an entire booklet, you get an individual study guide, all right? And there'll be one for this week, and there's one out there for next week, because I really believe that if you want to be a part of a class, you need to know what we're going to discuss that day. And so please, when you come in, not only pick up the one for this week, but pick up the one for next week, okay? So, as we think about the epistles of John and John's writings, what makes John and his writings? Well, I should ask first of all, what else did John write other than the epistles? The Gospel of John, all right? What else? Pardon? Revelation. All right, so he wrote Revelation, he wrote his gospel, and he wrote his epistles. Now, what makes the time period and John and these writings a little unique? Anybody? All right, now, is his spread out over a long period of time? Particularly the three, but what was the time period that they were probably written in? A lot later, all right? If we think about Revelation, well, I can ask, where was Revelation written at? Isle of Patmos, all right? Now, why was he there? We're going to go through this a little bit later. but he was there because the mission put him there as a part of the persecution of the church. Domitian was around, I forgot what, but about 90 to 97 AD. So that put John on the Isle of Patmos probably in the mid-90s, and him writing Revelation. Now, the rest is a little bit, I don't know whether we have a lot of history on it or not, but Barnes and others says that after the Isle of Patmos, he came back to Ephesus. And it is felt that he wrote his gospel and his epistles while at Ephesus. Now, so this would be around 100 AD. What makes that time stamp unique in reference to the rest of the New Testament? It was, right, the rest of the apostles have been dead now for 35 years, 30 to 35 years. So now you come in and you have John's writing about 35 years after anything. And think about this, and John is the last person that saw and touched Jesus that was alive. All right? So if we look at what we're reading here, this is the last inspired messages of the New Testament. And it was written along after the other letters. Well, why would that be unique then? Why would that make the message unique? Yes, what? More information. Right, that you would have, that you now have all the other writings that have been written, or all of Paul's messages have been written, the Gospels have been, the other three written. Yes. You can see, yeah, you can see more of the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Very good. Okay? You can see more of Christianity developing, and you also and that has positive things, but also has negative things, doesn't it? All right? How was the first gospel messages for years communicated? By mouth. All right? Now, you've all played the little game, haven't you, at school, where you get people in a circle and you tell something to one person, they sell it to the other, and it goes all around and comes back around. And Hayward, what does the last sound like? Nothing like the first. All right? Therefore, in that 35 years in here of oral communication, and yes, we do have the writings of Paul, and yes, we do have the writings of the other apostles and inspired people, but most of it was still communicated by orally. We didn't have a printing press. Not everybody had the Bible. So therefore, you see error coming into the church and in its teaching, and John hits this error. He approaches this error that is coming into the church in different manners, and we're going to see some of that as we go through it today. Now, as we think about it, I know it seems kind of smallish, but is there a difference between a letter and a book? What is the characteristics of a letter? John? Yeah, a book is very general. A writing's got a personal feeling in it. It's written to a particular person, isn't it? All right? Probably for a particular reason. Like whenever we were all young and writing love letters, there was a reason to write the love letters. Now, I guess nobody writes love letters anymore. They send emails, right? But there's a reason you're sending it to somebody. You're expressing something. Now, the problem we have in the New Testament with those writings, it's a one-way conversation. All right, we don't know what sparked this necessarily. So we have to look within the writing of the letter to kind of come out, well, why is he writing this? All right, now let's look at where a book is more general and is normally over a given topic for general distribution. It doesn't have the personal touch in it. Like in Paul's letters, you know, they all start out with a salutation, and at the end of it, he's saying, hello, say this to this person, tell this person hi, God bless this one, and it has a lot of people in it. All right, so now let's think about the New Testament. What's an example? Well, is Matthew a book or a letter? It's a book, all right? It's a general compilation of Matthew's account of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Is Luke a book or a letter?
It's a book. More of a letter.
Why is it more of a letter? It was written to a person, all right? Theophilus, all right? And if you take Luke, which was a letter, Acts, is it a book or a letter? No. Who's it written to? It's a letter. It's written to Theophilus. Now, I happen to feel, and this is not universal, that Luke and Acts was written for the defense of Paul before Nero's court. And I believe that Paul was released because there was nothing, the Jews did not even show up at his court after about 62 AD. All right, now that's not universal, all right? But if you look through, particularly Acts, you see it approaching Paul, and you see it coming to end when Paul is in prison, but he's never released from prison in that letter. There's nothing more said about him, all right? So, but it is a letter. And the only reason, the main reason why you have his gospel and Acts, the thought is that you couldn't get them all on one scroll. You had to have two scrolls because they were so big. So he broke them up. All right? Now, how about Revelation? Who was it written to? Seven churches of Asia. So now, so whenever you get into particularly a letter, the details and the background behind why this is written becomes more important to its understanding and grasping of the message, all right? So in John's epistles, it's a little strange, particularly his first one. Why it appears to be a book because there's not a salutation to it. There's not a greeting and not a salutation. So it looks like a book, but then you get into it and it has personal stuff in it. And it's written to my little children. All right, so it appears that it's a letter, but it's a letter written for general distribution. So it's not to a particular one, to a particular person, but it's more general distributed. So let's look at some of the more detail into some of this. If we look at Revelation, again, a little background on it. Well, I should get, no, that's all right. I'm sorry. Getting my notes all scrambled up here. If we look at Revelation, what was going on? What is the background for Revelation itself? Why was Paul on the Isle of Patmos again? Pardon? I'm sorry. Yeah, he was exiled, all right? Again, by Domitian, and we wonder sometimes, well, what was going on? And this makes the content of Revelation of how you interpret it. If we look at Nero, who did Paul in in Acts, when he was being brought to trial in Jerusalem, who did he appeal to? Nero. All right? Now, why would Paul appeal? Because he said, I appeal to Caesar. Well, that Caesar was Nero. Why would Paul appeal to an emperor that was persecuting the church? All right? Which shows that he really wasn't at the beginning of his reign. Now, when when he burned down Rome, and he blamed it on the Christians, then he started Christian persecution. But it wasn't necessarily widespread at that time. Well, then as the emperors started becoming more and more, because they thought they were God, they thought they were deity. At first, it was only after they died that they became deity. But then they took on and said, oh no, we're God. And Domitian took this on very seriously. And he had everybody either take some incense and put it in a fire, or take a denarius and donate it. But he had to say, Caesar is Lord. And this caused a big problems for Christians. They couldn't say this. And so they were persecuted. The persecution, if we go through Revelation, and if you talk about the 7 churches that are written, you can see that some of them, they weren't persecuted. Others were. Smyrna was. Ephesus was not so much. It depended upon where the government was really at. If you're in the backwoods, you didn't get it so much. So here in Revelation, John is telling, we see a picture of the martyrs being under the altar. And what did they ask? You remember? How long shall this continue? All right? How long? You know, here we are pleading. We're under the altar. You know, how long? And John, or Jesus through John, said, a little while longer. A little while longer. Well, a little while longer turned out to be over 200 years. All right? The Christians were persecuted through, well, Constantine stopped it, but then after Constantine, there's a couple emperors that still picked it up. So it was almost 400 before the persecution general of Christians stopped. We can see this in a man by the name of Polycarp. Anybody hear of Polycarp? All right. Polycarp was a bishop of Smyrna. And he was burned at the stake because he would not declare Caesar as Lord. Very good. Yes, here Polycarp is a person that knew John personally. John actually taught him. I mean, and at 86 years old, he says, you know, the Lord has taken care of me for 86 years. Why am I going to deny him now? And was burned at the stake. Ignatius was an interesting one of Antioch. And he was not totally contemporary with Polycarp, but close to it. They overlapped. Ignatius was a bishop of Antioch church. And he again would not say Caesar's Lord. And instead of burning him at the stake at his city or killing him at the city, they took him to Rome. And all along the journey at Rome, he wrote letters back to the various churches. And why is this important? Because it shows the stage of the church writings at 130, at their beliefs at 130. And their letter is similar to Paul's. But obviously they're not inspired letters. But it gives you some idea of the thinking of what was going on at that time. He actually wrote a letter to Rome and asked the church there not to interfere. He was going to be fed to the lions and the wild animals, and he said, don't interfere. I'm going to die. for my Lord. And so he did. So I brought those two examples up just to show that what was going on in Revelation continued on even while he was writing to the churches, the epistles and his gospel. Now, so Revelation was written to tell the people to hang on. The whole message is Jesus is going to overcome. Hang in there. Now we come down to the Gospel of John. What was going on at the time? It's not the persecution bit, but there's another problem that John was trying to correct there, and that was a doctrinal issue. And what was the main doctrinal issue that brought up? That Jesus actually was in the flesh. He was both deity and flesh, right? Very good. And that comes from Gnosticism, and that's when the Gnostic influence started affecting the church. So one of them was persecution. This was a doctrinal issue. And the Gnostics, they had the same problem that the Christians had with oral communication. And that is, not all Gnostics was the same. All right, there were different beliefs within Gnosticism. But the primary one was you could not be flesh and spirit at the same time. Now, there were two major tenets of this. One of them was saying, well, okay, I have to control my flesh. There's not going to be sex. I'm going to diet, restrict my activities, and almost kind of be a monk, all right? The other one said, well, if it doesn't matter, I'm going to enjoy it. And so they totally separated their worldly activity from their spiritual activity. But John was writing then to them, trying to make sure that they understood it. Let's turn to John chapter 1. And who's got John? John chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, and then verse 12. Who would have that for? Hayward?
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Verse 12.
14, I'm sorry.
The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one man born, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
So here in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and then verse 14, and the Word became flesh. So here we see in the very first chapter of the Gospel of John, him attacking the problem of Gnosticism. He didn't wait to 3 or 4 chapters into it, and he didn't say, hello, how are you? I hope everything's going well. He addressed it right here in the first 14 verses. And so this is the reason why it was written. Now, if you go on back and we get in, hey, we'll turn to chapter 20 and read 30 and 31 while you're there.
Jesus did many told miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
So, if I read Romans, chapter 1, verse 17 tells you up front why Romans is written. That we are justified by faith. All right? The righteous man shall live by faith. Everything in there supports that one verse. Here, John tells a problem up front, but then at the end, he says, now I'm going to tell you why I wrote all this. That Jesus really was there. He is the Son of God. And the whole book, in this case, is one miracle after another miracle after another miracle. So you see Jesus in the flesh doing a miracle. These people believed. He did another miracle. These people believed. And it's wrapped up in that one statement. All right. Yes.
This doesn't have anything to do with anything, but I just wondered if John is the only book that's written in third person.
It could be. I never thought about that. Yeah, but a book would go that way. It has a tendency, or could go that way, whereas a letter, you couldn't, right? Yeah, good point. All right, David, would you turn to 1 John now, chapter 1? You don't have it? All right. Who would have 1 John reading for me? All right. 1 John, the first 4 verses, please.
That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared, we have seen it and testified to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and has appeared to us. We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. We write this to make our joy complete.
Very good. Thank you. Now, if we look at these first verses, is there anything in there that is a little bit like his gospel? How does he talk about the presence of Jesus? Pardon? From the beginning. All right. And what else? We've seen him. We've seen him. We have touched him. All right. And this has 2 things. One, it is it's talking about the Gnosticism part. All right, he's physical. Well, I've seen him. I've touched him. I've talked to him. And John could do that. Now, what does that also tell you a little bit about how John could talk about authority to write these things? He's an eyewitness. All right? And he's the last eyewitness. And you think about John, all right? Where was John at during the trial of Jesus? Let me change it over. Where were the other apostles, taking Peter out of the equation? Where were the other apostles during Jesus' trial? They were gone. Scattered. It says they went home, all right? But they were out of there. And we know Peter tried to hang in there, but his faith just wouldn't quite let him. But where was John at? But he was at the trial. All right? Yes, he was at the trial. Now, Chris, at the cross, we see John at the cross, don't we? With Mary. All right? John was with Jesus right at the cross. He had a lot of understanding about his Lord that maybe the others didn't quite get until they were totally inspired. And John was the last apostle and the only apostle to die a natural death. So his writings are very important. But he had the authority. He could write this because he's saying, I have seen Jesus. I have touched Jesus. I've talked to Jesus. I know the man. And therefore, I can write these things to you. All right? Now, a little bit of an interest here. He's writing this from Ephesus. All right? In Revelation, what did he say about, in Revelation chapter 2, the first 7 verses, what did he talk about with the church at Ephesus? Remember the message that he wrote to them? They've left their first love. Thank you, Mark. So here he's going back to a church where he told them, you've lost their first love. If we look at John, what is one word in the epistle to John, particularly the first one, that stands out? Love. It's mentioned 42 times. All right, so here again we see him talking to a church that has lost their first love. When we come back with with a letter that they certainly would read there, because that's where they're at, he talks about love. He's instilling that in them too. So he's got two things going on. He's got right at the first, he's still dealing with the Gnosticism, but he's also trying to encourage them to love. And we will certainly get into much more detail. But the idea here is that you cannot touch an illusion. All right, Jesus had to be flesh because I touched him. Of course he was deity, of course he was spiritual, but he was not an illusion. And then he gets really more into this. Let's turn, and we're going to, as we go through the letter, we will get into some of this, but I want to try to point how the letter is written and for what reason. Let's go to 2 John verses 7 and 8. Chris, would you have that there? 2 John verses 7 and 8. There is only one.
Okay.
Yeah.
For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ is coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves that you do not lose what we have accomplished, that you may receive a full reward.
So, who is the Antichrist? Those that that won't acknowledge that Jesus came in the flesh. All right? So, again, we can see him throughout this talking about the Gnosticism, supporting the fact that Christ not only was deity, but he also came in the flesh. Now, there's another message before we jump right into some of the other. In 1 John 1, 8 and 9, we read, if we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. However, then in 1 John 3, 6 and 7, he says, no one who abides in him sins, and no one who sins has seen him or knows him. Now, if we read those, it looks like a contradiction. All right, so as we get into this, we're going to try to understand this contradiction. Some of it we'll work on next week. All right. So now let's talk about a little bit on, he's writing it. He's talking about, I've seen Jesus, I've touched Jesus, but he said, I'd like to make I want you to make my joy complete. And how would they make his joy complete? Fellowship. Very good. He is saying, he's saying that I want you to have fellowship in two ways. What's one of the ways he's going to have fellowship with? He wants them to have fellowship with him, right?
Jesus.
But he also wants them to have it with Jesus. So, if we think about our congregation, and I guess I'll just say this because it's the easiest way of doing it, all right? I've been a member of the Lord's Church for 69 years. I was baptized at age 10. I have been in various churches, and I tell people this is the most active, loving church that I've ever attended. There is more spirituality here, more loving kindness than any that I've ever attended. And it brings out then, because one is, I think one month we had a fellowship meal every weekend, you know. Maybe a little bit too many because we can't get to all of them, but it's not a handful that shows up. You know, you fill the gym and it's just, everybody pitches in. It's wonderful, all right? And that's what I think John was trying to say here. You know, you've got to have fellowship with, quote, one another, but you maintain that fellowship because you have the fellowship with him. And the two comes together. Now, those that are listening online, and during the pandemic, we loved our technology. We loved our technology. What do you lack when you're listening online? Fellowship. The reason, I think it's important for us to understand why we come to the assembly, all right? We get involved in Hebrews where we said, come together, but it's not a commandment. Why do we come together? To encourage one another. We are here to encourage one another. And yes, while we're here yes.
I think even back in Bible times, if we look at the examples, even though there was no technology, there was none that, like you said, they were always together, and they had to be back then, but still, if we follow those examples,
We'll be together.
Exactly.
Yeah, very good point. And she said, in Bible times, they met in individual. Isn't that strange? You're meeting in small groups, right? That was the Bible pattern. And so you had that fellowship. When my wife and I spent 2 years in England in 1990. We were transferred there with my job. And we found out in America, we ate out a lot with friends, right? In England, you could not eat out a lot or you'd go broke, all right? They did not have fast food restaurants. They had a pub, and then they had sit-down dining, right? But it was expensive to go out to eat. So what happened every Friday or Saturday night? You were in somebody's house, or they were in yours. And we found that we made closer friends in 2 years than what we had 20. And all of a sudden it dawned on us, a lot of our, quote, friends in America were acquaintances. They weren't friends. And when we came back, we started having people into our home. And they'd say, well, what do we bring? Nothing. This is not a potluck. This is for you to come and enjoy dinner with us. And our friendships really grew together. You have that same network in the church. And, you know, it's wonderful. Technology is great, but you don't have the encouragement, you don't have the fellowship that you have in person. And hopefully everybody that can will come back and enjoy that fellowship. Yes, okay. There's another apostle another writing, when Paul was talking about make my joy complete. In Philippians 2, sorry for that, I kind of lost my place. But in Philippians 2, Paul says, therefore, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any afflictions, and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. And again, it's very difficult to do that online. But it is important for us to come together to maintain that unity. And then in 3 John, the last epistle of John, he writes, I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. So John certainly had a wonderful experience in Ephesus. He certainly had a motive for being there, and he had a reason for writing these letters. Are there any comments before we just touch on next week? Any additional comments? All right, next week we're going to study a very interesting subject, I think, and that's walking in the light. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. So we want to talk about forgiveness of sin, confession, and how we can know that we are in a safe condition. God bless you. Thank you so much.